One of my friends had a birthday recently and I'm actually going to DC this weekend to see her. So as part of her gift, I got her this book, Babel. She's been on a fantasy kick recently, which is not really my area of expertise. And so someone at the bookstore recommended this to me. And then when I went to go check out, the lady who was ringing me up commented on how much she loved it. So I'm gonna take that as a good sign. And then to go along with the book, I also wanted to make her something, and I love themed gifts. And so I thought it'd be cute to make a book sleeve and matching book corner bookmarks. Both of these projects require very minimal fabric and are definitely beginner friendly. So I'm going to show how to make them. First up is the book sleeve. As far as materials goes, you're going to need fabric for the outer layer, lining, and ties, which can be all the same or all different depending on your design choice. For this project, I'm going to be using different fabrics for each of those pieces. And then optional, fusible fleece or batting to add a little bit of structure. First things first, we're going to measure the book's width, length, and depth to figure out the size of the rectangle to cut for the sleeve. For the rectangle's width, I'm considering the width of the book plus the depth of the book plus 2 times seam allowance plus 3/4 of an inch for ease. Then for the length of the rectangle, I'm considering the length of the book plus 1/2 of the depth of the book plus 2 times seam allowance plus 3/4 of an inch for ease. After calculating your dimensions, cut 2 rectangles in the outer layer fabric, 2 rectangles in the lining fabric, and optional 2 rectangles of fusible fleece or batting. I think fusible fleece is a lot easier to work with and what I opted to use for this project. Lastly, for the ties, cut 2 rectangles that are approximately 16 by 4 inches. Now since I'm using fusible fleece, I'm just going to quickly iron this on to the wrong side of my outer layer fabric. If you have batting, you can sew the batting to the wrong side of your outer layer fabric within your project's seam allowance. For example, I'm using 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, so I would sew the batting using an 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch seam allowance around all sides of the rectangle. And then personal preference, I wanted rounded corners on the bottom, so freehanded, slight curved edges on the bottom corners of the outer layer and lining pieces. Then place the outer layers good sides together and sew down one side around the bottom, up the other side. Do the same thing for the lining pieces, except be sure to leave a gap in the bottom edge, which we'll eventually use to turn the sleeve right side out. Put those pieces aside and grab the fabric for your ties. Fold these in half, hot dog or long edge to long edge, good sides together. Again, personal preference, decided to trim one end of the tie to a point, kind of like a ribbon, and we're going to sew along the long edge to the end of the point, leaving the opposite short end open for both ties. If you're using a wide seam allowance, I would recommend trimming some of the excess off in this step, then flip the ties right side out through the open end. I'm using a chopstick to poke out the corners, but just be careful not to poke holes in the ties. Give the ties a press at this stage if your fabric needs it. I'm using velvet, so opting out, but definitely would if I was using cotton. Then top stitch around the edge of the ties. You don't have to top stitch the open end since it'll be sewn into the sleeve. For both the outer layer and lining, cut notches into the bottom curves to help them lay flat, or just cut the corners if you left the sleeve rectangular. Now that we have the individual components sewn, we can work on assembling the sleeve. Grab the outer layer and mark the midpoint of either side of the sleeve opening with a pin. Then flip the lining right side out. Place it inside the outer layer and match and pin the side seams. Place one of the ties in between the outer layer and lining at one of the marked midpoints so that the open end of the tie is lined up with the top edge of the sleeve. Then flip the sleeve over and do the same on the opposite side with the second tie. Here's what we'll have at this point. Now we can sew around the entire top opening. Next, Pull out the lining and flip the sleeve right side out through the gap that we left in the bottom edge. Once everything's right side out, sew the lining closed, which you can either do at your machine or hand sew. I just opted to use my machine. Lastly, push the lining into the sleeve, give it a press, and top stitch around the opening. Once this step is done, we've got our final book sleeve, and now we can move on to the book corner. For materials, don't need much fabric at all, just a small piece for the base of the corner and fabric for the flap. And then interfacing is optional for this project if you're working with thin fabric and just want to add some stability. As far as the pattern, just need to cut a few squares, 2 in the base fabric, optional 2 in interfacing, and 1 in the flap fabric. All of my squares here are 2 3/4 by 2 3/4 inches, which will ultimately give me a 2 by 2 inch book corner since I'm using 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Lots of numbers being thrown out there, but the size is totally customizable. The side length of the pattern will just be the desired length of your final book corner plus 2 times seam allowance. Although I would be cautious about going smaller as it becomes harder to sew. Since I'm using interfacing, once everything's cut out, I'm going to iron the interfacing to the wrong side of the base fabric squares. After the prep is done, grab the flap fabric square, fold it in half into a triangle so that the good side of the fabric is showing, and press. Then we're going to top stitch along the fold. Next, place one of the base fabric squares right side up, line up the triangle that we just top stitched in one of the corners, then place the other base fabric square on top right side down. Sew around the edge of the square, making sure to leave a gap in one of the edges that the flap is not touching. Now you by no means have to do this, but I just wanted to share a sewing tip I learned to help get pointy corners. When you get to a corner, stop with the needle down, lift the presser foot up, and slide a long piece of loose thread in between the 2 layers of fabric so that the thread is right against the needle. Drop the presser foot down and move the needle 1 stitch. Then lift the presser foot back up, swing the end of the thread on the seam allowance side back in between the fabric so that both ends of the thread are now together on the same side. Then rotate the fabric and continue sewing. When doing this, I found it useful to cut the loose threads long enough so that both ends poke out of the gap that we're leaving to turn the corner right side out. Now we can clip the corners and trim seam allowance to reduce bulk. I recommend skipping the side with the gap so it's easier to sew closed once everything's right side out. Then when that's done, flip the book corner right side out through the gap. And here's where we can pull the strings to pop the corners out. Just remember to pull both ends of the thread at once so that it doesn't slip out. And then lastly, give the book corner a little press and top stitch around the sides that don't have a flap, which will close the hole. And here's how the final book corner and sleeve set came together. I really love how it turned out, and I hope you found this video useful.